Hello and welcome back to Only Pay. We'll be discussing about here's why you will never retire lifetime. Be sure to watch to all the way to the end. If you are new to the channel, then hit the subscribe button below from your life-changing content. You pay attention at school, you study hard, get a good job, work diligently throughout your career, all so that one day you can kick back and enjoy a nice pleasant retirement. That's the story anyway, but it's not one that always lives up to reality. There are countless stories of people with good jobs and diligent saving patterns still needing to work well into their twilight years. This is to say nothing of people that unfortunately never have the privilege of higher education or a stable career. Recent reports have found that less than 30% of American workers are on track to retire at all, and even fewer think they will have a comfortable retirement, and they might be right. I know you didn't want to hear this, but there are a few big factors to play in the world today that are going to keep monster younger generation in the workforce indefinitely. This is all before considering the major hiccup that the COVID-19 pandemic has been. A global event that has actually worked to widen the gap between younger generation with fewer assets and more precarious employment versus older generation which tend to be more secure. Now you might think you are different. You contribute to your 401k, save diligently, subscribe to OnlyPay, and even invest regular into the stock pays. Well, that's all great, but I might still have some bad news for you. There are lots of issues to play here. Housing, the stock market, and a series of broad economic conditions which might threaten the general assumption we make about indefinite growth. So, it's time to learn how money works to find out why we'll all be on the grind until we are 120 years old. So, the obvious first culprit is housing. Affording a home has become a major challenge for most workers in USA. I know this problem is nothing new, but there are still few important factors that people don't consider. Even very high income earners that graduate top universities and go into fields like banking or big tech tend to be moving to equal high cost of living areas like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Pew Research recently reported that a majority of young adults between the age of 18 to 30 are now living at home with their parents. The median age of first home buyer in 2019 was 34, and experts agree it's almost inevitable that figure will be pushed even higher by the pandemic. What's more is that young buyers tend to be purchasing smaller dwelling like apartments and townhouses rather than traditional free-standing family homes, not because they don't want to, because they can't afford it. This is the real issue, because most financial secure people will tell you their house is their biggest asset. This doesn't just mean it's the asset that they own that's worth the most money either. Owning a house means that you don't have rental expense, and even if you are paying a mortgage, those payments will at least partially be building equity in the home itself. What's more is that once that mortgage is paid off, you have somewhere to live with very little ongoing cost. Retiring with a home means that even modest retirement saving or a pension can go very long way when compared to someone who will need to stretch those payments to cover rent. If a homeowner is running low on cash in retirement, it could be simple as downsizing their family home. A luxury not possible for someone who hasn't fully paid off their home or doesn't own one at all. Now let's be generous and take this median age of 34 to buy a first home. Stick a 30-year mortgage on top of it, and suddenly even the generous assumption of regular young worker is in their mid-60s still paying off a home loan. This is assuming that this person never upgrade their home or renovate or does anything to increase their mortgage from the original one they take out over 30 years. The particularly morbid amongst You might think, well, the boomers have to die and leave us their home eventually, right? And well, yeah, I guess so. Unpleasant as that may be, it is reality. The problem is this will likely one exacerbate the issue. We saw this in our video on why family fortunes disappear. Inheritance that could actually fund a retirement tend to go to people that are already pretty old and wealthy themselves. Now, again, the affordable house issue is debate as old as modern capitalism, but maybe this isn't an issue anyway. Maybe you are still unconcerned because you have planned to fund your retirement even without a house to call you own. Well, okay, let's put these plans to the test. The stock market is the other major vehicle by which people fund their retirement. Even fixed income pension funds ultimately rely on the growth of this market to provide incomes to their members in retirement, but this assumption of endless returns may be under threat. To understand why, consider a simple example. 10 lumberjacks are working at the sawmill that creates frame for residential homes. At the moment, the lumberjacks are only using basic hand tool, but if they all work hard and nobody slacks off, they will meet their quotas. One particularly astute lumberjack takes a portion of his paycheck and over time uses it to fund research into a motorized tools. His money will well spent because he eventually invents the table saw. Then he saves a bit more money. His money to buy a material need to build 9 copies of his contraptions. He then gives these 9 table saw to his colleagues who had previously been using those hand tools. This boosts their productivity enough that they can still meet their quota even if the first lumberjack doesn't show up work at all. This is what we call capital investment, and it's how last theory in this we can still sustainable fund people retirements. The same number of frames are made and the other 9 lumberjacks don't need to work longer and harder, and the first lumberjack has been properly rewarded for his creation with a nicely cushy retirement. Of course, this is very crude example, but in reality most people do the same thing just through the medium of the stock market. Companies raise money and then use that money to purchase capital equipment which will allow their workers to effectively and efficiently produce goods and services for the economy. But let's go back to our oversimplified example. Problems start arise when more of these lumberjacks gets a same bright idea. One might invest into a forklift to make the work of 9 men possible with just 8, and other then might do the same with nail guns to make the work remains 8 men possible with just 7, and so on. But every time this happens, it gets a fair bit harder to find the next thing. Eventually, you are going to need an almost fully automated production line, and even then you are probably going to work at least one worker there are overseas in operation. Every human you take out of equation and replace with piece of capital becomes more and more expensive, especially when compared to some other alternative investments. Let's say Lumberjacks 5 will need to invest $1 million into a robotic arms in order to effectively retire while still ensuring the quota of lumber mill is met. He might just say it, what I'll do instead is just buy a factory or required remaining 4 workers to work under extra 10 hours a week to pick up my slack while I go home and retire. How many hours a week are you working on your job just to cover your rent? This investment into non-productive asset that don't actually assist in adding value is a major hurdle. Now the classic example of non-productive asset is something like gold, Bitcoin, Pokemon cards, and of course real estate. Now real estate is weird because unlike this other non-productive asset, it does produce income without needing to be sold. It does through rent. Investing into real estate has been particularly attractive investment for a lot of people, which does two things. It increases the price of real estate, causing more of this issue we saw in the first part of this video. But it takes away from investment into types of productive asset that can sustainably fund retirements. There is one other problem beyond this, the overinflation of all asset markets. Let's look our original example of these table saws. They were machines that made cut up pieces of wood. Let's say they can chop up 20 pieces each day. Now let's replace those table saws with shears. These effectively machines for making money in the form of dividends. Let's say each shear makes $20 a day. In both examples, lumberjack would need to be own 9 of each to be able to fund their retirements. 180 pieces of wood would replace their job at lumber mill, and $180 a day would replace their income, so their works just fine. Now, counterintuitively, becomes problem arise when the asset become more expensive. Most people stock getting more expensive is good thing, and it is for the people that are already own them. Imagine each share was trading for $10,000, saving up $90,000 is pretty tall order for lumberjack, and 180 per day, but it's certainly possible over working career. Now imagine those same shares were trading for $100,000 while still paying the same $20 daily dividend. If you are already on these shares, you would be feel great because you are on paper net worth has grown handsomely, but Lumberjacks has by 900,000 worth of shares to fund his retirement, which is just non-realistic possible within his working career. Now, this might sound like far-fetched example, but it isn't. It's exactly what's happening today. To see this, let's look at the price to earns ratio of S&P 500. Historically, it has hovered around a multiple of 15. This time, that on average it would take the earning on their shares 15 years to pay off your shares itself. Today, that multiple is sitting just under 50 years, which is the second highest it's been in history, falling only behind late 2008, which as you know was a time for widespread economic prosperity. In plain English, this means people are going to either need to invest 3 times as much to fund their retirements or rely on the next biggest idiot to buy their shares off them in retirement of 100 times multiple, 200 times multiple, 1000 times multiple, which by the way certain investments are already doing the sum of stocks. Now you might say, oh well, shares aren't like table shares with fixed output. These dividends can and likely will increase in the future, right? And sure, that's almost guaranteed, but it's still unlikely we will ever see widespread PE ratios under 20 again for 2 reasons. Number 1, if a company does start paying out a consistently high dividend relative to its market price, well, the investors buy it, which will push up the price, meaning that it won't a great deal anymore. Market force are bitch. Number 2, reason is a bit more complicated, but it's one that has leading economists genuinely concerned. Robert J. Gordon is an American economist who published this paper with the National Bureau of Economic Research. Is US economic growth over? Faltering innovation confronts the six headwinds. It's fantastic paper that it is surprisingly readable even the people without the strong economic background. But spoiler alert, Gordon basically argues that the past 200 years of innovation, the economic growth were more an expectations rather than the rule that we should continue to expect indefinitely into the future. Limitless growth in an infinite world, you would do the maths. Gordon basically argues that this generation is the 5th lumberjack. All the essay innovation that drastically improve productivity have already been made. and even gradual improvement from here on out will either very expensive or just rent seeking a nature. Working more to shift value around in new creative ways more than working to actually create any. If this rather bleak outlook wasn't good enough, Gordon argued that this would coincide with what he described as the six economic headwinds. These are forces that will act to slow growth in economic around the world for at least the next 100 years. These headwinds are the loss of demographic dividend. Basically, the economy saw a huge boost when women started to move into the workforce between 1960s to 1990s. Now, most women in developed countries were professional careers similar to their male counterparts, but that's just a starter quo now. We aren't ever going to be able to double the workforce again unless, well, we make people work later and later in their lives. The second headwind is in the loss, the educational entertainment, particularly in USA. Education is becoming more expensive, less comprehensive, and increasingly irrelevant to the requirement of the modern workforce. A 3-year degree simply does not mean much as it did 50 years ago. Not an individual or the economy as a whole. The third headwind is rising inequality, a touchy subject at least times, but Gordon was surprisingly pragmatic about his approach to this issue. The paper noted that incomes were on average increasing by around 1.3% a year, but that growth was heavily focused on the top of 1%. The remaining 99% only actually saw income growth of around 0.75% year over year, not even enough to keep up with inflation. That means that if this trend continues, it will be inevitable that the larger pools of workers simply won't have the financial means to save their retirement. However, if you are on top of 1%, congratulations. You can say nah, your video title is wrong in the comment section. The fourth headwind is impact of globalization. Now, the theory globalization should make everybody wealthier, and on average it does, but average have outliers, and those outliers in this case will be national workforce that have historically enjoy high income relative to the rest of the world, like say probably you watching. The other side of this equation is that it should equalize global wages, meaning it is great for people in countries that have typically had low income compared to the global average. Oh, and of course the business owners that can profit from the pool of cheap labor along the way. The fifth headwind is energy and environment. The growth of past century was driven by fossil fuel, a cheap, easily transportable, incredible efficient source of energy that could power everything from automobiles to jetliners. But of course, they are finite resources that have come at cost. This cost will now be paid by younger generation either in the form of environmental regulation that slow down industrial output or from complete environmental collapse that will also slow down production. The final headwind is debt. Household debt, government debt, corporate debt, it's been all growing steadily over years and eventually this needs to be paid back. This is ultimately going to result in the requirements for more income or less spending. For the government, producing more income is easy than just tax more, but for individuals and business, the only option they might have been spending less. If someone already running on a tight budget, then those regular contribution to the retirement account might be what ends up getting sacrificed. Gordon did present a likely outcome to alternative the sixth issue for all parties, and you might be able to guess what it is. Yep, pushback retirement stages. If this has already been bit bleak of you and still thinking you are going to make millions overnight, then go on you. I will have work harder, crushing at sprit and text time. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe and be sure to turn on the bell notification so don't